Hi everyone, my name is Caroline Variath and I'm from the Faculty of Nursing at Humber School of Health Sciences. This is part 2 of my 2-part video on ABG Analysis, and in this video we're going to look at how to analyze partially compensated blood gas levels, fully compensated blood gas levels, and also some mixed acid-base imbalances. So in my last video I went over what are the steps involved in analyzing a blood gas result. So using that information, we're equipped with that information to tackle these examples that I've put on the board already. So we're going to go through how to analyze blood gas of a partially compensated blood gas. So as always, we're going to start with the pH. So first of all, to see if there's any issues with the pH, we're going to look at what the level is. So 7.30. 7.30 on the pH is less than 7.35. Therefore, the pH is acidic. Okay, and the next step is to look at the PCO2. PCO2, carbon dioxide, is 33. So 33 is less than 35. So the carbon dioxide is now alkaline. PCO2 is alkaline. Okay, and thirdly, we're looking at the bicarb. Bicarb is 16. 16 is much less than 21. So remember, bicarbonate is that buffer. So there's not enough buffers to get rid of the acidity. So if there's less than 21, then the blood becomes acidic. So bicarb is acidic. So now, because we know the pH is in acidosis, we also know that the bicarb is causing that acidosis because the bicarb is low, and there's not, which means there's not enough buffers to get rid of all of that acid, right? So bicarb represents the metabolic system. So this is metabolic acidosis. However, in the past examples that we've looked at, the other value is usually normal, right? So in this case, the other value is carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is not really normal here. It's gone the other way. It's become more basic. So acidic is the bicarbonate, and the carbon dioxide's become more basic, become more alkaline. So what the respiratory system is trying to do is to try and help out the pH of the blood, because the metabolic system is making it more acidotic. So the respiratory system is kicking in and saying, there's an issue with my pH. It is too acidic. I've got to try and help and make it alkaline. Remember that the body has that amazing ability to compensate for something that's going on with the body and to kind of maintain that homeostasis. So in this case, the respiratory system is taking it upon themselves to kind of compensate for whatever's going on with the pH. So, however, the compensation is partial in the sense the pH has not completely normalized. So the whole idea of the respiratory system is to normalize the pH. However, the pH is still on the acidotic side, still acidotic. It's 7.3, still acidotic. Therefore, the compensation is not complete. It's only partial. It'll be complete if the pH was normal. So this is partially compensated metabolic acidosis, and the compensation is occurring through respiratory alkalosis. So when you think about this client, so let's say the same example as we used before, the client came in with diabetic ketoacidosis, a CO3 16, which means that their bicarbonate can't keep up with the amount of acid this condition's creating in the body, because it's getting rid of all of that acid, and the kidneys are not able to produce enough bicarb. Remember, kidneys take much longer to respond to changes in the pH. So therefore, the lungs say, oh, hang on, the blood is really acidic, so I'm going to try and help out here. I'm going to get rid of more carbon dioxide, which makes the blood more acidic. So therefore, the lung starts blowing out carbon dioxide. And if you remember the pathophysiology of diabetic ketoacidosis, remember Kussmaul breathing. Basically, all that client is trying to do is breathe out all of that carbon dioxide just to make the blood a little bit more alkaline and help out that pH. Okay, so that's example number 1. So let's move on. So remember, so it's tic-tac-toe method still works. They all align. However, the other side is also affected. So you just want to make sure you know what that means and what it's trying to do. Just so here, the PCO2 is trying to compensate for whatever the metabolic system is doing. So it's creating the acidity and the pH. So PCO2 is making the blood more alkaline. Okay, so example 2. Same thing again. We're going to do step-by-step analysis. So pH is 7.48. So that's what we're going to look at first. Where does the pH lie? 7.48 is greater than 7.45. Therefore, the pH is alkaline. So pH is alkaline. Now, we've got to figure out, like always, what is creating that alkalosis. Is it the respiratory component or is it a metabolic component? So let's look at the PCO2 first. So PCO2 is 48. 48 is greater than 45. Therefore, the PCO2 is actually acidic. Greater than 45, acidic. So remember, more CO2 in our bloodstream, the more acidic the blood is. And number 3, we're going to look at the bicarbonate. Now the bicarbonate is 33, which is greater than 28, which means the bicarbonate is alkaline. So we know that the blood is in an alkalotic state, right? So alkalosis. What's creating the alkalosis? We already know that because bicarb is alkalotic. So that's what's causing the pH to be alkalotic. Bicarb, there's the buffers. Remember, the buffer is the normal amount of buffers in our body, or bicarbonate, is 21 to 28. Now the count is 33. That means there's an abundance. They're getting rid of that acidemia. Therefore, we're in a state of alkalosis. So it's metabolic alkalosis. So what happens to the lungs again? So the lungs are trying to help out again, right? Because the metabolic system is creating the pH to be alkalotic. So the lungs are like, hang on, the blood is too alkaline. I need to try and help out the blood and make it more normal, or bring it back to normal. So what does it do? So what are we lacking here? Because the bicarbonate is high, we're losing hydrogen ions, or losing the acidemia. So what does the lungs do? It increases the CO2 level by retaining CO2 and thereby increase hydrogen ions, right? So therefore making the blood more acidic. Okay, so when you think about a client who's presenting with this presentation, how do you think this would be reflected? Like that PCO2 is increasing to 48. How do you think that will be reflected? So basically they're retaining their CO2. So when you look at the client was breathing at a respiratory rate of 16, and all of a sudden it's dropped to 12 because they want to try and reduce that breathing in order to hold on to that CO2, as opposed to here, we're just trying to blow it out. Here it's trying to keep it in. Okay, so these are some of the things that you want to look at in your client. So moving on to the next one. So just so we finish off, here's metabolic alkalosis, and what is happening here? The respiratory system is compensating. So respiratory compensation, and what kind of compensation is it? It's partial. So this is partially compensated metabolic alkalosis, and it's compensated by the respiratory acidosis. It's partially compensated metabolic alkalosis. Okay, and let's look at the last example. So again, we've got to look at each of the elements one by one, starting with the pH, because we've got to figure out what's going on with the pH first, right? And it doesn't matter even if it's a normal blood gas, you want to look at all 3 elements just to make sure that whether to see if it's a normal blood gas or if there's that compensation occurring, whether it's full or partial. So pH is 7.28. 7.28 is less than 7.35. Therefore, the pH is in an acidotic state. Right? So the initial problem we know is acidosis. Our next job is to figure out what is actually causing that acidosis. And how do we figure it out? We're going to look at the next two elements, starting with the PCO2. So PCO2 is 55. So PCO2 is 55, which is greater than 45, and therefore the PCO2 in this client is acidotic. Okay, so now what is step 3 is to look at the bicarbonate. Bicarbonate is 30. 30 is greater than 28. Therefore, this is alkaline. So HCO3 is alkaline. So using the tic-tac-toe method, we know the acidosis is now caused by the respiratory component. So this is, the initial problem here is respiratory acidosis. And what is the kidneys trying to do? So the metabolic component of is actually trying to compensate for this increased acidemia. So there's excess production of, remember, carbon dioxide in excess leads to carbonic acid production. Therefore, the client is in respiratory acidosis, right? pH is acidic. So what does the metabolic component think? Okay, now the pH is acidic. We need to bring it back to normal as we can. Therefore, what does the kidneys do? It tries and produces more buffers, more bicarbonate, in order to try and get rid of that acid or the acidic state of the blood. So we're on that topic, the kidneys usually take much longer to create these compensatory or bring about compensation than the respiratory system. The respiratory system's compensation for these two scenarios will be within minutes, whereas the kidneys take much longer to create this compensation. So this situation, example 3, is respiratory acidosis that has been partially compensated by metabolic alkalosis. Okay, so I hope all of this makes sense. And once you've figured this out, our next step is to look at fully compensated. If these processes continue on, what does that entail? It means that would lead to full compensation. So we'll go through some examples of blood gas analysis on full compensation next. Okay, so now that we've looked at partial compensation, we're going to move on to doing some examples on full compensation. So one of the first things to remember in a fully compensated arterial blood gas is that the pH value is going to be normal. But when you're analyzing any blood gas, you're going to go through all 3 of those main elements that we're looking at, and that way we can tell if it's a normal blood gas where all 3 components are normal, or if the pH is normal just because there has been a full amount of compensation by one or the other of the 2 systems, or either the respiratory component or the metabolic component, to see if they've compensated for something that's already going on with the pH. So let's start off by analyzing this first example here. So first step, as usual, is to look at the pH. The pH is 7.36, which falls within 7.35 and 7.45. So pH here is normal. Okay, but remember, always look at all the 3 elements. So looking at PCO2 here. PCO2 is 33. 33 is less than 35, and therefore the PCO2, or the amount of carbon dioxide in this client's body, is low. So PCO2 is 33, therefore it's making the blood alkaline. So PCO2 is in the alkaline state. So the third one that we're going to look at is HCO3, or bicarb. Bicarb is 19, which is less than 21, which means the bicarb is in an acidic state. So it's making the blood more acidic. So now that we know that pH is normal, the next thing we need to know, and then now that we also know that there is respiratory issues and metabolic issues. However, if there's a fully compensated blood gas, it's usually because there was an initial problem. So our job now is to figure out what the initial problem is. And if you also notice that in this scenario, like they don't line up like it did for basic blood gas analysis and also for partial compensation. The pH lines up with one or the other in one column, and it doesn't happen in full compensation. But this gives you a good visual to see where everything lies and to see how to analyze this further from where we are now. So pH is normal. So how do we know what the initial problem was? So that's our first step in figuring out that full compensation. What was our initial problem? So if this is a client you're taking care of in a clinical setting, you would figure that out by looking at the client, looking at previous blood gas results to see what the initial problem was, or also even just looking at the client's condition. What do they come in with? What are their signs and symptoms? That will give you more information on what that primary cause of problem was. But for studying purposes or learning purposes, we just are going to look at the pH, and we're going to look at this spectrum here. So 7.35 to 7.45 is normal. So what is center of that is 7.4. 7.4 is that median. Anything less than 7.4 would be acidic. Anything greater than 7.4 is alkaline. So in this situation, this client's pH was 7.36. So 7.36 is less than 7.4, therefore it is more acidic. So example 1, the initial problem of this pH is acidosis. So now we already have lots more information to go by. Oh, we know the acidosis was caused by the metabolic component, which is the bicarbonate. So the initial problem of this client was metabolic acidosis. And now the body, remember, the body is trying to create that homeostasis. So the respiratory system has gone on to compensate for that acidemia by making the blood more alkalotic. How? By getting rid of more carbon dioxide. Remember, carbon dioxide is also an acid. So by getting rid of more carbon dioxide, it's kind of maintaining, because remember, the bicarb is making the blood acidic. So the carbon dioxide is now correcting that by becoming more alkaline. So it's fully compensated. Metabolic acidosis. So always remember, in full compensation, when the first value is going acidic, the other value will become alkalinic, just like partial compensation. So they go the opposite way in order to create or make that pH normal. Okay? So now let's look at example 2. So example 2, again, we're going to start with the pH, always the same steps. So 1, 2, 3. So we're going to look at the pH. pH is 7.44. 7.44 is between 7.35 and 7.45. So pH is normal. Okay? So now, but let's see if this is a normal blood gas or a fully compensated blood gas. And how do we know that? We're going to check PCO2. PCO2 is 50, which is greater than 45. So for PCO2 is acidic. PCO2. And so we're also going to look at the bicarbonate. The bicarbonate is 30, which is greater than 28. And the bicarbonate is alkaline. Okay, so this is a fully compensated blood gas result, but we need to figure out what the primary problem is. So how are we going to do that? We're going to look at this grid. So pH is 7.44. So this is step 3. pH is 7.44. 7.44 is greater than 7.4, which makes the blood alkaline. Right, this one here. So makes the blood alkaline. So the blood is an alkalosis. Okay, so we know that. What's causing the alkalosis? So now we know where to look. So alkalosis, we already have something under there. So the bicarbonate is already alkalotic. So the primary problem is metabolic alkalosis. Okay, metabolic alkalosis. pH is on the alkaline side of the spectrum, and the bicarbonate is also alkaline because it's greater than 28. So now what has the lungs gone on to do? So lungs have detected that the blood is more alkaline. So lungs are like, okay, I'm going to help out here. I'm going to retain. I'm going to kind of not let go of a lot of carbon dioxide, because carbon dioxide is acid. So the lungs are trying to keep more carbon dioxide in the bloodstream to make the blood more acidic, so kind of just to balance that pH out. And when you look at the client, what do you think you might see? So if the PaCO2 is low, they're blowing out too much, so they're hyperventilating. And when they want to retain that PaCO2, their respiratory rate might decrease because they don't want to get rid of more of that carbon dioxide. So this is a fully compensated metabolic alkalosis, and it's compensated by respiratory acidosis. Okay, so let's look at our final example here. So same way, we're going to start off with all the three elements. Number one will be to look at the pH. So pH of the blood is 7.37. 7.37 is between 7.35 and 7.45. Now 7.37 is therefore normal. So pH is normal. Again, we need to make sure that whether we want to see if it's a normal blood gas or a fully compensated blood gas. And how are we going to do that? So number two, PaCO2. PaCO2 is 50. So PaCO2 greater than 45 makes the blood acidic. So PaCO2 is 50, which means that PaCO2 is acidic. And then the bicarb is 33. So bicarb at 33, which is greater than 28, which means bicarb is alkaline. CO3. So pH is normal. Both the PaCO2 and the bicarbonate are both abnormal. So now how do we figure out what the primary problem was? So looking at the pH, pH is 7.37. It falls below 7.4, which means the primary problem was probably acidosis. It's acidosis. Primary problem is acidosis because the pH is less than 7.4. Remember, in a clinical setting, you're going to look at the patient to give you that answer. Okay? So now we know, because we know the pH was acidotic to begin with, we're going to look at what's causing that acidosis, and that would be your respiratory system. So it is respiratory acidosis. But the kidneys so the metabolic system is compensating for it by making the blood more alkaline. And how are we doing that? So the normal bicarbonate level is 21 to 28. So respiratory acidosis, the blood is more acidic. So what does the kidneys do, or the metabolic system? How does that take over? It produces way more buffers. Remember what the buffers do? They combine with the hydrogen ions and gets rid of it. So makes the blood more alkaline. So that way, they're getting rid of more of the hydrogen ions and thereby making the blood more alkaline. So when PaCO2 is becoming acidic, how the compensation is occurring is by the bicarbonate becoming alkaline. So it's always that the opposite way. They go the opposite way in order for that full compensation to occur. So if you practice this will help you figure out what the difference is: a basic arterial blood gas level or analysis, a partially compensated blood gas analysis, and now a fully compensated blood gas analysis. A lot of the times I get a question saying, what if the pH is 7.4? How do we figure out what the primary problem was? In a test, you won't be asked a full compensation with a pH of 7.4. However, in the clinical setting, you're going to again look at the client to figure out whether it was an acidic issue or an alkalinitic issue, and what the first initial culprit was, whether it was the respiratory component or the metabolic component. And one last type of blood gas that I want to go through is a mixed acid-base imbalance. So if the pH is 3.30 and PaCO2 is 50, and bicarb is 19. So pH is 3.30, which is less than 3. You know what I mean, 7. 7.30. So 7.30 is less than, if it was 3.30, that client is dead. Okay, that is a really low pH value. So if it is 7.30, which means it's acidic. So 7.30 is less than 7.35, therefore pH is acidic. Right? And PCO2 is 50, which is greater than 4.5, which also makes the PCO2 acidic. And HCO3 is 19, which is less than 21, which also makes the blood acidic. Now, in most conditions, if the primary problem is acidosis, if it's respiratory, then the metabolic component becomes more alkaline, or vice versa. But in the mixed acid-base imbalance, they both go the same way. So it's because the body can't compensate for this, or because both of those systems have an issue. So the respiratory system have an issue, metabolic system have, and that's usually seen in a very, very sick client. The prognosis is usually poor as well. So that sums up your basic blood gas analysis, your partially compensated blood gas analysis, your fully compensated blood gas analysis, and also mixed acid-base imbalance. When you are looking at these blood gases, always remember that there is a client attached to these numbers, and you want to look at how these numbers are going to be reflected on the client. What kind of signs and symptoms are you going to look for? Or the other way around, you know what the client's presenting with, and you kind of anticipate what that blood gas is going to look like, because you know what that, like let's say if the patient has a high respiratory rate and they're hyperventilating, you know that their PCO2 is going to be low. Or if they've got kidney failure and they're not producing any bicarbonate, that the bicarbonate level is going to be low. So things like that, just putting the pieces together will help you actually care for your client more comprehensively. Okay, so I hope this really helps out, and I hope you follow these steps to analyze any blood gas you get. And yeah, good luck.